Despite the ongoing protest in the nation of Japan, and the Japanese citizens tend to hold disgruntled attitude towards the current leader, especially that the current leader Kishida invited and also held the G7 summit in this country at one of the most controversial places called Hiroshima. But meanwhile, how should we understand the agenda throughout the entire meeting? Some believe that the G7 summit, which include the 7 largest countries and also the 7 largest powers in the world, are trying to come up with a better plan to fight against China. But meanwhile, if you follow the news closely, Ukrainian President Zelensky also participated in the G7 summit. Now this time, is the fate of the country is going to be turned around? And how does the message sent to Putin at this moment? But meanwhile, what about the future for NATO? And in this episode, we're going to cover all of them in details. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you follow our show, you should be familiar with our distinguished speaker, which is Professor Marc Lanteigne. Again, Professor Lanteigne teaches in political science, including international relations, comparative politics, and country includes China, Asia Pacific, Oceania, polar regions, and his research also includes security studies and comparative political economy. Well, Professor Marc, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks, great to be back.
Well, Professor Marc, again, as we mentioned before, I want to start with the G7 summit. But meanwhile, the current Japanese Prime Minister Kishida recently wrote an amazing article and published on the US website. And I want to read something to you. I want to get your reaction regarding the reason why he picked Hiroshima as the location. And this is what he wrote, and I quote, "I chose Hiroshima to host the G7 summit because there's no better place to send a urgent message spoken in one voice by the 7 leaders that we must do something and everything we can to continue the 77-year-old record of the non-use of nuclear weapons since the bombing of Hiroshima." Now, but meanwhile, Professor Marc, we know that the ongoing protest took place nationwide in Japan because the Prime Minister picked the place to host the G7 summit. From your perspective, how should we understand the plan, and why do you think that Kishida picked Hiroshima to be the ideal location to host the 7 leaders? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. The choice of Hiroshima, yes, it was a very, very strong statement. And it certainly reflects concerns not only by the Kishida government, but also by other G7 leaders that nuclear danger is starting to grow. There have been a few cases where there have been threats by the Russian government to potentially use a nuclear option regarding Ukraine. There is a lot of concern about proliferation in general, including in the Asia Pacific. So I see this as quite a powerful statement, although I completely understand how it would be very controversial.
But meanwhile, again, Professor Marc, we know that historically speaking, Hiroshima's past should serve as a reminder about what happened, again, when it comes to a breakdown of the world orders. But meanwhile, today, everyone is looking at peace and looking at stability. Now, help us with better understanding. The 7 leaders got together this time, and also, as we mentioned before, the current president of Ukraine also participated at the G7 summit. How significant was the presence of Zelensky? And also, what kind of strong message did that send, not just to the world, and especially to Vladimir Putin at this moment?
Yeah, I think that the Zelensky visit had 2 major purposes. First of all, to really demonstrate solidarity with Ukraine in its time of need. But second, also Zelensky wanted to remind these leaders that this is still an ongoing conflict, that there is still a great deal of danger, that Zelensky has been calling upon the G7 leaders to provide further support, including, for example, the recent decision by the US government to potentially allow for F-16 fighter jets to be used by the Ukrainian military. As Ukraine is starting to move closer to a potential spring offensive. I think that the Ukrainian leader really wanted to ensure that he had as much political backing as possible, especially at a time where the conflict has been going on for more than a year now. As you point out, there are other security issues that are starting to appear that were also brought up at the meeting. Not only China, but the growing concern about AI, artificial intelligence. So it was very, very important for Ukrainian leaders to remind the leadership of the need to continue to support Ukraine at this time.
Well, but Professor Mark, the reality is Vladimir Putin has not stopped the war at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, and we've heard the statement and also the rhetoric under Vladimir Putin and also under his administration that his plan is to move forward. And he is not going to stop until he accomplishes his personal or political goals. So again, by having Zelensky to meet up with the leaders for the 7 countries, how effective do you think of the message? And also, why do you think that the Zelensky at this moment had the full persuasion or had the capability continue to ask for support from those leaders and also their countries?
From a practical viewpoint, there is still going to be a need for the Ukrainian military to have a replenishment of supplies, and that includes weaponry, but also just basically material. Especially, as you correctly point out, Russia is not stopping. The Putin government is basically trapped. They are not in a position to engage in any kind of concessions, but they're finding it extremely difficult to go forward. The current conflict in Bakhmut is really kind of stressing that. It's been back and forth. The city belongs to us. The city belongs to us. And we're talking about one city. We are talking about a Russian military that has not pretty much succeeded in any of its primary goals in Ukraine over the past year. So now the worry is that this is going to be a war of attrition, and there's very little possibility, I should say, for any kind of stop in the hostilities.
And I want you to help us with better understanding regarding Kishida's performance, because we know that before being the host for the G7 summit, and Kishida has been very active in voicing his support to the country of Ukraine, of course, and also he paid a visit to Ukraine, and also he met up with the Ukrainian president. So now, overall, why do you think that Japan, or why do you think the prime minister is so active in supporting Ukrainian? Is it just really to send a message to the world to say, hey, listen, we're with you and we're standing behind you, and this is not really the war for you, but this is the war for the world? Or Kishida had a better message or had a better ambitions while supporting the nation of Ukraine? How should we understand that?
Now, it's a very good question. And there has been the view among other leaders in the Asia Pacific that this is primarily a European war, that this is not a conflict which has any serious basis, not having any particular effect in the Asia Pacific. Now, the Japanese government is stressing that no, that is not the case. This is certainly a conflict of global concern, that it is time for all states to basically provide support for Ukraine, to help other countries of the G7 provide for Ukraine, and to support it in these very difficult times. The other point, though, is that the Japanese government is starting to kind of rebuild a lot of its diplomatic relations, including with the United States, now that the Biden government is there, and the Biden government has been trying to make its own kind of repair policies towards the Asia Pacific. I think the Kishida government really wants to take advantage of that atmosphere.
Well, let's bring China into our conversation again, Professor Mark. As you mentioned before, as soon as the 7 leaders got together, well, guess what? China had to be one of the major topics. And mainly that today, when we look at China, it's not just about this political influence and also this unstoppable economic growth. Now, again, based on the latest article, it says, now the 7 countries, they formed this, what we called G7 communicate, that's specifically targeting Chinese economic growth. But meanwhile, the communicate layout, and I quote, the policy approaches are not designed to harm China, nor do they seek to thwart China's economic progress and development. A growing China that plays by international rules would be global interest. Professor Mark, you and I, we know, asking for a country to play by the international rules is not a piece of cake. specifically that we're looking at China, we're looking at other countries. Professor Mark, I want to get your reaction. Number one, what is the international rule laid out by the G7 communicate from your perspective? And number two, why do you think that China should obey or disobey the international rule based on this communique? What do you say to that?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, the use, especially by the United States, but also by other countries, of the international rules-based order is a complicated one, not only for China, but for Russia. There is the tendency for both Beijing and Moscow to interpret that as Western hegemony, that the United States is trying to maintain a system whereby it stays at the top of the pyramid. And China especially has been arguing that, look, the situation has changed, that the US and Europe should not engage in, to use the Chinese government term, a Cold War mentality, to pretend like it's another Cold War and to take the same steps as were taken towards the Soviet Union, and that the circumstances have changed. Now, after the G7, there were certainly comments directed towards China, talking about the need for a peaceful Indo-Pacific. And there was also a lot of concern directed at China for economic coercion. And certainly China, in many ways and occasions, has used its economic power in order to influence foreign policy. The most recent example being in Lithuania, which recently opened up a Taiwan office, and trade between China and Lithuania has basically ceased. And this has obviously caused a great deal of concern amongst the European Union, of which Lithuania is a member. So China is really being looked at not only as a challenge, but as a multifaceted challenge. So when China is being told, okay, you need to follow the international rules-based order, well, China's argument is that, well, it is actually the United States which is manipulating the rules, that has very often use the rules in order to maintain its place at the top of the hierarchy. So China's starting to get, the Chinese government, I should say, is getting much less patient with that kind of perceived activity.
Professor Mark, again, if I'm not mistaken, that when we look at this relationship between US and China, of course, in reality, there are many rumors on the street and some believe it's better for China to stay cool with the US at this moment. And meanwhile, both sides need to really calm down, maybe take a approach back or take a step back before we have further dialogues or engagement. But meanwhile, let's go back to another piece of reality is look at the 7 leaders from the G7 summit. Germany, France, both countries' representatives and leaders visited China again at the tipping point. And especially, we had the conversation last time Emmanuel Macron visited China. And again, after his visitation, he was critically and also heavily criticized by his attitude. Some believe he changed his tones on China, especially related to territorial dispute, related to some of the critical issues. But meanwhile, we have also seen other leaders who has not changed their rhetoric towards China. For example, Canada. Now, again, based on this message and based on the group inside, how do you think that the 7 countries could form a unified message regarding China if the 7 leaders are holding different positions towards China, not just politically, but also we're looking at this economic and social changes today? What do you say to that?
You just hit upon a very important point if we're going to be discussing the idea of whether this is a Cold War. The main reason why I don't tend to use that particular kind of phrasing is, unlike during the Soviet times, where trade between East and West was in many cases negligible, China is still the second largest economy in the world. It is coming out of a very long period of economic isolation. And China is very anxious to jumpstart economic relations with many parts of the world, including in Europe. So the idea of isolating China, the idea of isolating the Chinese economy is considered a non-starter for many in Europe, especially as a result of the trauma that have taken place over the past few years. So now the big buzzword, and it came up quite a bit at the G7, is not decoupling. In other words, trying to remove economic dependence between the West and China, but de-risking. That has been interpreted as, okay, we continue to develop very strong relations with China, but we try to protect areas of sensitivity, security sensitivity, such as high technology, the issue going on right now with semiconductors, to reduce the risks involved in continuing relations with China. Now, you're very right, though, that this is going to be a very complicated process, especially as a result of a lot of concern that we might be seeing a vastly different US in the space of a year and a half, depending on which way the next presidential elections go.
That's right.
The two frontrunners in the US election are, to put it very charitably, isolationist. I'm talking about Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. There is the worry, and I think this was reflected in some of Macron's statements, that, okay, the US is with us now, but is that going to be the case later on? So that also tends to affect many countries like Germany, France, Britain, their view of China in the longer run.
Meanwhile, during the G7 summit, and also the countries called on China to participate more regarding climate change and biodiversity crisis and conservation of natural resources, etc. Again, we know that for those ongoing projects, China, there's no doubt that plays a rather indispensable and critical role. But here's another question, Professor Mark. Why do you think China is very much interested in participating in those projects if those countries are being so critical and also being so judgmental regarding China's current economic and political growth? So in other words, hey, listen, I want to be friends with you, but you have to be polite with me. But meanwhile, if you keep on holding this disgruntled and judgmental attitude, don't expect me to play my chip, or don't expect me to contribute so much under this condition. What do you say to that?
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why there are several policymakers, both in the US and in Europe, who are calling for guardrails in the relationship. You talk about climate change, and there was a little bit of criticism that climate change was not as strongly brought up at the G7 as it should have been. There's also concern, for example, in the Pacific. The original plan was that President Biden was going to be visiting Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby, to sign a regional agreement. He was unable to do so because of the debt ceiling emergency, so he had to go back to Washington early. But in the Pacific, there is a lot of concern that, well, it's all very nice to talk about military issues, but we're facing some very serious environmental problems right now. So when we talk about the US and China, China's had the opportunity over the past few years to understand that climate change simply can't be subdivided, that this is a global concern and pretty much all actors are needed. The environment is definitely one area where the United States and China should be engaging in deep dialogue. But if the concern about China's security policies, China's economic policies overshadows that, key work on climate change might be damaged. So I can see the frustration on both sides to say, okay, is there any way that we could at least compartmentalize some of our disputes so we can actually continue a dialogue in key areas such as dealing with the environment?
But meanwhile, Professor Mark, if I'm not mistaken, again, let's go back to the relationship between China and the US. During one interview, again, the spokesperson for the U.S. government, I believe, is the U.S. National Security Advisor, and he was asked regarding the China-U.S. relation, and this is what he said, and I quote, "It's not a cartoonish or one-dimensional policy. It's a multi-dimensional complex policy for a complex relationship with a really important country." Now, again, just within his answer, he used a lot of big words. And for example, it's not one-dimensional, it's a multi-dimensional, or it's a complex relationship, and for a complex policy. Now, again, Professor Mark, you are the expert. It sounded to me this is a pure political soundbite, or this is a dodgeball answer. So in other words, dealing with China is not easy, and United States cannot shoulder this responsibility by itself. We need partners. Now, from your perspective, and also your reaction, how much do you think that both sides can actually buy into such a political bite or political soundbite? Is it really too complicated for both sides to handle this deadlock right now? Or you think it's much easier for them to walk away from this relationship for a couple months and then we can figure out a new way or figure out a new strategy to bring the cards on the table? What do you say to that?
You raise the point that sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish the politics from the policy. And there is a very significant difference between the two. As we're heading into a new U.S. election season, there has been a lot of pressure on potential candidates, policymakers to look tough on China. And that has created what many critics have noted is a zero-sum approach, that there simply can't be any room for compromise, discussion, because otherwise that demonstrates political weakness. Now, I completely agree. This is an extremely complicated relationship. We're talking about two great powers. We're talking about two powers with a great deal of comprehensive power across several different areas. Whether it is too difficult, that's where things get a little bit debatable, because we are talking about two countries with a very long-standing relationship. Certainly, there are a considerable number, understandably, of political and security differences between the two. But there is also a great deal of potential for at least maintaining dialogues. I mentioned the environment before, but also areas related to economics, areas related to just understanding the need for various areas of global cooperation that really need to, again, provide guardrails in this relationship.
Professor Mark, one more question regarding the G7 summit, and before we move on to the next session. We know this time not only the Ukrainian president was invited, and also another critical member was invited to the G7 summit as well, which is Modi, who is the current Prime Minister of India. He was also invited to attend the summit. Now, rumors on the street that next time, perhaps in the shorter distance, or maybe in a shorter way, that we'll see is the G7 Summit Plus. So which means we're going to see more members going to participate for the next round. Now, help us with better understanding what is the significance of India to participate for the G7 summit, and also given the fact that Modi has been trying to strengthen the relationship with the US and also the trade relationship with, for example, Germany, France, and also Canada. Now, how much do you think that the nation of India is able to contribute to the G7 or to the 7 countries, and meanwhile continue to compete on this economic level with China? What do you say to that?
I could add another country to that list, however. I would also add Russia. The Indian government has been very careful not to distance itself too much from Russia. It has been considerably more neutral in its stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is certainly not engaged in the same level of sanctions as we've seen in Europe and North America. And India has been very, very dedicated to kind of walking the line between Russia and the West in this particular time. Now, India is a member of the Quad security group, and the United States is very hopeful that India will be an anchor of Indo-Pacific security cooperation. It's also important to note, though, that India is a member of the BRICS, which has both Russia and China as members. And the BRICS are going to be having a very important summit in Cape Town next month, where there's even the expectation that more members will be added. So India is going to be in the spotlight there. So India, because of its size, not only economically, but also population, it's now the largest country in the world by population as of a few months ago. India is really wanting to take advantage of this global spotlight, but it's in so doing, it has really tried to maintain a non-aligned stance, which is going to be very difficult to keep going in the longer term, I would say, especially because India is going to be called upon by the United States to really show better dedication to security cooperation in the Asia Pacific. And that is also going to mean a much more difficult relationship, as you say, between India and China.
That's what I was going to ask you. One more, Professor Mark, is don't you think that India today is actually placing itself in a very awkward position, and given the fact that, again, you're looking at India, it's in this prime location for this BRICS. And again, we know that today that BRICS constitute a lot of significant players, including China, including Brazil, and also Russia. But meanwhile, India cannot afford to break the ties with China. And again, given this economic and also this political relationship. Now, how do you think that India is going to balance the relationship with China and also with the US? Just, again, maybe not keep both sides happy, but meanwhile, not to lose the partners from this economic perspective. How do you think India is going to perform?
Yeah, this is not a new question for India. This is certainly not a new situation. It has certainly become more complicated. But for a very long time, India has had to deal with China not only directly, but also with China's very strong relationship with Pakistan, ever since which has only been strengthened since the Belt and Road came to be. But now, though, India has a much bigger problem of the fact that we now have a resurgent Russia, or at least a Russia that is trying to be resurgent. We have a much more complicated set of economic linkages, which India is trying to maintain. And now, with all of this discussion about new security architecture, in the Asia Pacific, where India is considered a very important contributor, it is going to be a very delicate balancing act. And one problem is that will India be able to maintain its kind of front yard security arrangements? And I'm talking about countering Pakistan, dealing with Afghanistan, dealing with South Asia as a whole, with the fact that you now have the Pacific starting to encroach on India's interests, trying to get India's attention and say, well, we'd like your help with this as well.
Well, let's get to the last portion of our conversation regarding NATO. Again, Professor Marc, recently we know that you came out with a lot more publications and research on this important, again, organization. Now, help us with better understanding how significant is NATO today? And given the fact, and if I'm not mistaken, that Ukraine is more likely to be admitted as a new member for NATO, of course, that could really hurt Russia, and especially it's a slap in the face for Vladimir Putin. So number one, what is the significance of NATO today after looking at the war in Ukraine and after witnessing this, what we call the hawkish behavior from Vladimir Putin? And also, how likely can we expect that Ukraine is going to be admitted to be additional member into NATO, and what is the impact for the world? What do you say to that?
A very short time ago, we're talking about a few years ago, there was a lot of debate over whether NATO was a relic, that it was obsolete, that it was simply not able to address emerging security issues. The situation has changed dramatically. Now NATO is frontline with in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO has obviously been right at the forefront to support Ukraine, to support Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression. And the organization is growing. It just admitted Finland a very short time ago, so that means that NATO has a much longer border on Russia than ever before. Sweden wants to become a member. There's still quite a bit of, shall we say, internal issues within Europe, primarily with Turkey and Hungary over exactly how that timetable is going to work. But even if it's a question of just a bit of extra time, Sweden is interested in engaging much more directly with NATO. So now NATO is much more formidable as not only a security actor, but a political actor than even a short time ago. How that is going to affect security elsewhere, though, is going to be very key. Now, Ukraine, discussions about allowing Ukraine to be admitted into NATO have been going on for quite some time. And there was some criticism that, okay, a decision on this should have been clarified considerably earlier. But the way the situation is now, certainly there are those who argue that now Ukraine should be admitted into NATO. In the short term, it's going to be very difficult with the conflict, especially with parts of Ukraine still under Russian occupation. But there is the view, and this has come out quite a bit in a lot of European security commentary, that in order to have a unified, strong Europe, Ukraine must be there.
Well, Professor Marc, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you a very simple question. Again, when we look at the war in Ukraine and we look at everything going on regarding the international crisis, one thing that everyone is paying attention is what we called international security. So in other words, we shouldn't see any other wars, or at least that within this year or within the following 2 or 3 years, that we would not see any major wars going to break out. But meanwhile, every country is very concerned regarding the security and also this international security. Now, by having NATO or by having the partners such as US and Turkey, again, many countries in this organization, how much do you think that international security can be promised or can be guaranteed, and so that we are not going to see any possible wars or any conflict that could really break up the international order? What do you say to that?
Okay. Well, my diplomatic response would be it depends on what kind of conflicts we're talking about, and it depends on what kind of wars we're talking about. Now, NATO was created during the Cold War to specifically act as a counterweight against the Soviet Union and later on to Russia. NATO is designed to deal with state-to-state conflict. However, it has been involved, obviously, in other security areas beyond strictly state conflict. One question which is going to be key, we've seen over the past few months greater interest of countries in the Asia Pacific. You mentioned Japan. I would also add South Korea in further cooperating with NATO. And that has led to some discussions and even some criticism from China that NATO might be expanding its interests further outside of Europe. That said, we are dealing with other areas of security, such as civil conflicts. I point to the very tragic situation going on right now in Sudan. We are also seeing the omnipresent problem of terrorism that NATO is less defined to address. So when we talk about where the next conflicts are coming from, certainly there is the possibility of future state-to-state conflict. People are looking at the Asia-Pacific, obviously, with a great deal of concern. But with the problem of civil conflicts, with the problems of state weakness, and now the emerging issue which came up at the G7 AI, whether that could be used for strategic purposes, used for weaponized purposes. I think the whole subject of war and conflict is really undergoing a massive transformation. NATO will be front and center in some of these areas, but certainly when we talk about conflict, it is certainly not going to be restricted to one alliance or one part of the world.
Well, of course, Professor Mark, I agree with you 100% because, again, as we mentioned before, today, not only China, but also the US is standing at the crossroads. We're looking at this political change. And again, US is continuing to be a major player for NATO, for the G7, and also the G20, and for many other countries. But meanwhile, again, as we repeated many times, the last thing we want to see today is a war. Of course, no one would like to pay for the war, and no one would like to see the devastation to the war or from the war. Or again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor Marc Lanteigne. Again, Professor Lanteigne teaches in political science, including international relations and comparative politics. Of course, his study also focuses on security and studies and also comparative political economy. Well, Professor Mark, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's always been a pleasure. Again, every time we talk to you, you always offer us meaningful and insightful analysis, not just about China, but also the matters around the world. So thank you so much again, taking your time to do this.